Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne McDonald. I'm in the incoming chair of RCIScience, and I'm happy to welcome you here today to our exciting and topical panel. I know these are super weird circumstances. We would prefer to be with you in person, but we're doing the best we can, and we have a whole lot of exciting events coming up throughout the year, all virtual, so you can stay home in your jammies and learn about science. So we're going to carry on regardless. We're going to have a break from COVID-related news today to another horrible thing, the wildfires. But this is going to be a really interesting panel. It's going to be moderated by science writer Edward Struzik. We are going to have 3 short presentations by our experts, and then we're going to have a moderated question and answer session. And you can submit your audience questions. So you can submit your questions or comments in the chat box or via Twitter. You can see below at RCIScience or by email at information@rciscience.ca. And just a reminder, please be polite and respectful. We're going to have moderators monitoring the chat room, and we'll take action as appropriate. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator this afternoon, Edward Struzik.
Hello, all.
Hi. So Ed is a previous RCIScience Fleming Medal recipient, which is fantastic. So he's familiar with RCIScience. He's an established writer, educator, public speaker, and a fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy in the School of Policy Studies at Queen's in Kingston, Ontario. His many articles and essays appear in journals, magazines, and newspapers such as Scientific American, Natural History, National Geographic, Los Angeles Times, Globe and Mail, National Post, the list goes on. He's an award-winning author with 6 books under his belt. Firestorm, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future, won the Science and Society Book Award in 2018 and is featured in our Fall Reads Book Club. So if you haven't been part of our book club, now's your chance to join. Take it away, Ed.
Okay, well, let me just start off by telling you how we got to where we are right now. And we'll just start with a simple equation. What's required to start a wildfire? Basically 3 things: oxygen, heat, and fuel. So before the Europeans arrived on the scene, we know from charcoal records derived from lake sediments and peats at hundreds of sites around the world that there was a distinct lull in burning from around 1600 to 1750. And that lull in fire occurred during the Little Ice Age, sometime between 1500 to 1850, when temperatures in North America, Britain, and Scandinavia dropped by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. We know that lightning strikes accounted for an unknown but significant number of fires before the arrival of Europeans, and presumably many of these fires loomed large because resources were not there to suppress them. We just didn't have firefighters on the ground. We also know that humans were also part of the fire equation. Indigenous people routinely lit fires to clear the land in order to attract game and to nurture the growth of berries and root vegetables. Europeans really didn't understand that. They had a hard time coming to grips with this burning of the grasslands and the forest. And John Sullivan summed it up. He was with the Palliser expedition in 1860. He said, "It is most lamentable to see so often such masses of valuable timber destroyed, almost invariably by wanton carelessness and mischief. Unfortunately, the Indians have a most disastrous habit of setting the prairie on fire for the most trivial and worse than usual reasons." It's understandable to some extent. Most of the early settlers came from Great Britain, where there were few, if any, wildfires of significance, and they arrived at a time when that Little Ice Age brought cool, wet weather to the east coast of North America. But then a new reality unfolded as that Little Ice Age sputtered to an end. Higher temperatures and more lightning set the stage for big fires in forested landscapes that were rapidly filling up with people. And a big fire such as Miramichi, which burned in Maine and New Brunswick in 1825, was inevitable. And you look at it, Fort McMurray, which was a huge fire, 1.5 million acres burned. Miramichi was 3 times that size. And of course, no one knew how to deal with a fire as big as Miramichi because they'd never seen anything like it. And this is one recollection from the past. Those fortunate enough to be near a river took refuge in the water, often trying to coax their cows and pigs with them. The livestock were panicked by the smoke and the flames and refused to enter. Most of them succumbed to the heat and smoke. Wild animals had no such fear of water. humans in the river found themselves surrounded by wildlife, including raccoons, deer, bears, and even large moose. And then as it got hotter and drier, big fires followed with increasing frequency. The Peshtigo fire in 1871 in northern Wisconsin killed 2,400 people. The Great Fire of 1908 in Fernie, British Columbia killed 22 people. The Porcupine Wildfire of 1911, Ontario, 200 dead. Newspaper quote here from the Toronto Star: a fire tornado sucked the oxygen out of the atmosphere with such force that mature trees were ripped from the ground. People who took refuge in the mine shafts were asphyxiated. Others drowned when a boxcar of dynamite exploded by the shores of Porcupine Lake. The wealthy owner of one of the mines in the region died trying to save his cat. And then there was the biggest fire, the most disastrous fire of them all, the Matheson Fire in northern Ontario in 1916. Officially, 223 people died, probably a lot more than that. But the fire that really defined our history of fires, the fire of 1910, where in 1,736 small fires were smoldering in northern Idaho and western Montana, and many more in southern BC and Alberta. Hurricane force winds blew in late that summer, burning 3 million acres in just 3 days. 86 people died. Probably thousands would have had the army not come in and the railway companies not come in to help. And by this time, people started to think that maybe we've got to figure out how to learn to live with fire. One of them was California timber harvester George Hoxie, who said, we had best adopt fire as our servant, otherwise it will be our master. And he had a lot of support. He suggested that we do what Indigenous people did, light small fires to reduce the amount of fuel that could burn in the forest. And the state engineer of California was in favor of it. A lot of timber owners were in favor of it. The Southern Pacific Railroad was in favor of it. He may have prevailed if the fourth element not been added to the fire triangle following the big burn of 1910, politics. The big burn of 1910 ignited a culture of wildfire suppression. Politically, something had to be done to adapt to this new reality. Henry Graves, who was the U.S. Forest Service chief from 1910 to 1920, said that forest fire protection is the first measure necessary for the successful practice of forestry. And those people who support the doctrine of light burning, which he called nothing less than the advocacy of forest destruction, and those who preach that doctrine have a large share of responsibility for fires which their influences caused. And on our side of the border, Bernard Furnaw, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto and a member of the Government of Canada's Commission of Conservation, he saw fire in a similar way as the worst enemy, and forests as crops that need to be harvested, not burned, and conflagrations are due largely to bad habits and loose morals. It became a religious thing. So in the decades that followed, a number of strategies were implemented on both sides of the border to reduce the amount of fire on the landscape. What's the first thing that we did? Well, we kicked First Nations people out of national parks such as Yellowstone and Yosemite, as well as Banff and Jasper and Riding Mountain National Park. A more organized, institutionalized forest firefighting strategy was put into place. We built fire lookouts. Tree phones were used to communicate the location of a fire to a wildfire control center that dispatched firefighters by foot, by horse, by truck, by boat even, by rail car, by train. We even had the Royal Canadian Air Force pilots being deployed to find fires. And the Canadian Mounties set up fire crews. Parks Canada set up a national firefighting training program. Civilians on both sides of the border were encouraged to participate. And then we got Smokey the Bear, who became the North American symbol of the effort to promote forest fire prevention. And just as importantly, science added sophistication to fire suppression strategies. We got to be very successful in suppressing fires for the 80, 90 years following the big burn of 1910. And you can see the numbers in the US between 1920 and 1950, 10 to 50 million acres burned annually in the US. By the 1950s, it was as low as 1.9 million acres. Something had to give with so much fuel on the ground. The century-long demonization of fire continued until 1988, when the U.S. National Park Service officially allowed lightning-triggered fires in Yellowstone to burn. And the timing was unfortunate. because the fires that burned during that summer put fear in the hearts of decision makers and a public that had all but forgotten or had never heard of the Great Fire of 1910. Newspaper headlines thought that Yellowstone, a national icon, would be lost forever. President Reagan was very angry. He dismissed the relatively new let burn policy in Yellowstone as cockamamie, and he sent his Interior Secretary into Yellowstone to see what was going on, and he described it as absurd, and he ordered national park officials to fight all fires from that point on. Time, of course, proved them to be wrong. Grizzly bears and black bears immediately moved into the burned areas to feed on carrion. Fire beetles moved in to lay their eggs on warm stumps. Nighthawks and woodpeckers fed on the beetles. Owls nested in the snags, feeding their chicks rodents that were more exposed in fire-scarred areas. Aspen shoots shot up even as the fires smoldered. Elk and bison moved in to feed on aspen shoots. The coniferous trees followed, and grizzly bears fattened up on root berries that thrived in burned out areas where the sun was able to shine through to the ground. 30 years later, it's hard to detect any evidence of that fire. But then we have a new paradigm that's unfolding, and that's climate change. With climate change, we're getting more lightning. You look at the equation, it's approximately 1 degree increase in temperature results in about 12% increase in lightning. We're also getting more powerful wind events, extended droughts, disease, and more insect invasions such as the mountain pine beetle. And combined together, they're beginning to test the limits of our firefighting resources, as we've been seeing with the destructive fires that have been burning more often. Slave Lake, Alberta, 2011. Fort McMurray, 2016. BC had its worst fire season in 2017. 2018 was one of Ontario's most costly. And then we all know from the newspaper headlines what happened in Australia earlier this year and what's currently happening in California right now. So with us this afternoon, we've got some people who are going to tell us, some experts who are going to tell us how is this going to play out. Jane Park is a fire vegetation specialist for the Banfield unit at Parks Canada. Dr. Stephanie Montesanti is the associate professor of School of Public Health at the University of Alberta and also a scientist for the Center for Health Communities, the School of Public Health. And Dr. Sophie Wilkinson is a postdoctoral fellow at Eco-Hydrology Group, the School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster University. So we shall hear from them.
Thanks, Ed. So I'll get started right away. Thanks to Carrie and Suzanne and the rest of the team as well. So hi, my name is Sophie Wilkinson, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at McMaster University. And today I'm going to talk to you about our burning boreal, in particular peatland wildfires in Canada. After a quick overview of what peatlands are, I'll discuss the process of how they burn, how this might change in the future, and how this affects our ability to live with wildfire. So the boreal forest encircles the northern latitudes, mainly across Scandinavia, Russia, and Canada. And 28% of this global boreal forest is situated within Canada. And this represents one of the largest contiguous forests left on Earth. The boreal is a mosaic of different forest and ecosystem types, and a predominant but potentially undervalued ecosystem are peatlands. Canada has one of the biggest coverages of peatlands of any country, and here they cover around 1.1 million kilometers squared, which is equivalent to about 13% of our land area. On this map, you can see the greener areas are the peatland dominated regions, and they extend up to the discontinuous permafrost in the Yukon and northern Alberta, and then all the way down to the US-Canada border in northern Ontario and across to Quebec. This map shows the areas of land that have burned since 1980. So that's just in the last 40 years. And you can see that this pattern tracks right along the boreal, which is of course right through many peatland-dominated regions. So as Ed did, I would like to highlight that wildfire is an absolutely natural and necessary component of the boreal, and it works to regenerate the ecosystems, which helps to maintain their health and their long-term carbon uptake. As fire moves through the landscape, peatlands experience fire too, and studies find that they actually burn at a very similar rate to upland forest stands, and in some regions this is around every 100 to 150 years, making it quite a regular fire cycle. But because peatlands are very different to upland stands, and they are the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet, how they interact with fire can have serious consequences for the total boreal carbon sink, and also have impacts on our society and economy. So what are peatlands? Peatlands are actually a type of wetland, and there's many types of peatlands within this broad category. But a common feature of them is that they have this layer of peat just below their surface. Peat is partially decomposed organic matter. That is, it's the remains of vegetation that are undergoing incredibly slow decomposition. Decomposition of this organic material is so slow because the ecosystems are typically cold and wet, with a water table just below their ground surface. In northern regions, they're typically expansive, reaching as far as the eye can see, and these peatland complexes are made up of lots of different peatland types, some of which support dense trees and some of which don't. Most of these have been developing for over 8,000 years, since the last glacial period. One of the best peat-forming vegetation types is moss, and these mosses grow really slowly but continuously, and they get buried underground where they turn into peat, and they can store tons and tons of carbon in peat, which can be up to 10 meters deep. Because peat is such pure organic material, peatlands represent the densest carbon store of any ecosystem on Earth, and it's estimated that northern peatlands store over 400 gigatons of carbon. That's 5 times more than the Amazon rainforest. This is one reason why it's so important that we understand how they interact with fire and also how this might change in the future. Recently, I worked with a team of illustrators at the National Geographic to put together these diagrams that help show the different types of peatland wildfires. The first is when fire moves through a healthy, wet peatland. Here on the left, the fire may just run along the surface and remove above ground shrubs and small trees like black spruce trees, which actually need the fire to spread their seeds for regeneration. In this case, we would say the fire is low intensity and low severity, with little carbon lost, and the peatland recovers quickly within a few years. The second is when fire occurs in a dry or heavily treed peatland. The peatland could have drained directly or indirectly by humans, or the region could be experiencing a drought, meaning that that peatland is drier than normal. And in this case, the top layers of the peat are exposed to fire, and after any trees have burned, this means that the fire can then move down into the peat profile, moving through the peat and consuming it, releasing the carbon as it goes. In this case, the fire is high intensity and the peatland is severely impacted, and suppression of these fires is extremely difficult. So this is an image of the Chuckegg Creek fire in 2019, and you might have seen similar fairly shocking images from other peatland-dominated region fires like the Slave Lake and the Fort McMurray fires. And these are examples where peatlands were in dry states and they actively enhanced these fires. The thing to remember here is that in healthy wet states, peatlands will act as fire breaks, slowing the spread of fire and sapping it of its energy. But in dry states, they can connect parts of the landscape and contribute to these mega fires. So when we move inside the fire, this is what it looks like. The fire front moves through the peatland, consuming all the above ground fine fuels like branches and needles, and then the fire is concentrated at the ground level. And you can see this here because this fire is burning in a peatland, and that peat is such a huge fuel source for the fire. After the flaming front has moved through, you're left with what we call smouldering combustion, and it's actually a fire within the peat deposits themselves. Smouldering is slow-moving, flameless combustion which produces smoke at the surface. And this is the most challenging part of peatland fires for wildfire managers and wildfire suppression efforts, because smouldering fire is really difficult to detect because it doesn't have those flames, and it can survive underground for weeks or months, and even over winter. Other than the direct carbon emissions, which add to national and global greenhouse gas emissions, the negative impacts of peat fires are all in relation to human society, communities, infrastructure, industry, as well as direct threats to human and health and well-being. Peat smouldering is a principal source of smoke and particulate matter emission, and this image actually shows an area of peatland that burned in the Fort McMurray fire that Stephanie will be discussing more later as well. And this shows the effect of the fire on the visibility on Highway 63. So this is the main evacuation route out of Fort McMurray, where 80,000 people were evacuated in just over 2 days. And the site that I studied was right between the lanes of the highway, just behind the smoke in this photo. If the smouldering fire continues to burn, it can burn right down through the peat profile until it's limited by either high water content or until the fire runs out of fuel, in this case peat. This peatland I studied burned with extreme severity, and the peatland was combusted right down to mineral soil in some places. We estimate that this peat was over 3,000 years old, and now all that old carbon is back in the atmosphere. Globally, peat fires contribute a significant proportion of anthropogenic emissions each year. And unfortunately, the combination of climate change drying out many peatland-rich areas and more people and infrastructure on our boreal landscape mean that peatland fires in Canada are predicted to become worse with more instances of this smouldering combustion. In addition to the potential impact on global climate, this will also impact local and national public health through smoke pollution, and could also cause the most severely burned peatlands to disappear from the landscape altogether due to something called ecosystem regime shifts. But there is hope, and that's what we're all holding on to right now, because luckily peatlands are incredibly resilient systems. And so far we find that they have an amazing ability to recover from even severe fire. In some peatlands, this is mainly due to a group of specially adapted mosses that are so good at holding on to water that they're actually resistant to fire. They act as an energy sink and help slow the spread of fire. These are called sphagnum mosses, and they often form in these mounds called hummocks. The orange color that you can see in these photos is actually moss that has survived combustion by the fire. And the photo on the right was taken just hours after an experimental fire that I was involved in with the Canadian Forestry Service to gather more information about peatland fires and how to manage them. And amazingly, this sphagnum hummock survived whilst everything else around it burned. Some of my work now includes developing proactive management treatments using forestry techniques to help reduce the intensity and severity of peat fires, especially close to communities and infrastructure. In the long term, we're aiming to promote the growth of sphagnum mosses that will naturally reduce fire intensity and increase climate resilience for many years. This will be critical for us to understand how to live safely with wildfire in these regions and across Canada. So I hope that's given you a good overview of why you should care about peatlands, especially with respect to wildfire in Canada. So I will pass back to Ed now. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jane Park, and I am the Fire and Vegetation Specialist for the Banff Field Unit in Banff National Park in Canada. I'm going to be talking to you today about kind of the interface and the landscape between wildfire, the types of wildfires that both Ed and Sophie chatted about, and kind of how the human picture in terms of communities and landscape management fits into that picture. I wanted to start first by acknowledging that Banff National Park, where I'm located, is within the present day territories of the Treaty 6, 7, 8 peoples, as well as the Métis homelands, and to acknowledge that the lands and waters of Banff National Park have been used for millennia by Indigenous peoples for sustenance, ceremony, trade, and travel, including fire management. And we thank them for their continuous stewardship and sharing the land with us here. So as I go through my slides, some of these things will be familiar from both Ed and Sophie's presentations, but I'll give you some local context. Banff National Park is located in Alberta in the Canadian Rockies. We were the first national park in Canada to be established in 1885. It's just where the yellow star is there. And this is where I am. So I'm in the Banff town site. This is a view from the 1920s. And so you can see in this photo that the landscape is really heterogeneous. It's got a lot of open meadowlands. There are open Douglas fir and aspen grasslands. For those of you familiar with the area, the mountain you see there in the background is Mount Norquay. There's a ski area there now where people ski. And I'll just transition that to a more recent photo from 1984. And now you can see that that ski area is fully treed. It's a homogeneous stand of coniferous trees. And the only things that are open are the ski areas. And you can see now how development of the town has kind of been embedded in that kind of matrix of dense forest. And this is kind of like the conundrum and the challenge that a lot of land managers face, both in Canada and the US, where fire is part of the ecosystem. We live in fire-prone environments, but we've now injected communities into these landscapes, and we've done a really good job of putting fires out over time. So if you look at what's happened in Banff specifically, this is the area burned by wildfire over time up until the late 60s. And it mirrors what Ed said about, big fires in the early 1900s in this area. A lot of them either started by lightning or the railway coming through. And then you can see that over time, we've had many years with absolutely no fire. And that is atypical for the fire regime or the fire history of this area. Fire history studies have showed that within Banff, it's typical for about 2,800 hectares to burn on an annual basis throughout this area. So we got really good at putting fires out, and fires basically were eliminated from our landscape and the ecosystem, resulting in these really dense, thick, coniferous and flammable forests. Right in the middle, that's where the town is. We have a permanent population somewhere around 8,000, maybe slightly less during COVID. We have annual visitation here of over 4 million people, mostly in July and August, pre-COVID. And the tourism industry impacts are a huge concern. That's a large input to the Alberta economy, to the Canadian economy. Most people visit the town of Banff. Largely, many people don't even leave the town of Banff. So there is a disconnect sometimes with the ecosystem and the processes that go on in the park. We also have the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the main transportation corridor for transport across Canada. Shutting the Trans-Canada down affects the Canadian economy heavily, even with a short closure. We have scenic routes, and we also have the CP Railway that goes through. So it's quite a complex landscape, even though we are fire prone to manage. You couple that with climate change, as Ed indicated. In our area, this figure here shows how much our fire seasons will increase over time in the next kind of 50 to 70 years. And, in some places of the park, we will experience up to 60 additional days of fire season. So we'll have longer fire seasons. Most of the research shows that they will be drier, more severe. So how do we look at this landscape and make sure that both kind of socially and economically, but also at the ecosystem level, we're more resilient to land? So in Parks Canada, we recognize that fire is a critical process in the environment. And there are kind of three things that I'll touch on for my presentation, which are that we want to promote landscape resilience to wildfire and climate change through prescribed fire, managed wildfire, and fuel management. The first piece of the puzzle, everybody's familiar with fire suppression. So, if you just focus on this map here, in Parks Canada, we've zoned the park in terms of, red, yellow, and green. In the red zone, that's where our infrastructure is. So in those areas, it's incompatible to have out of control wildfires overlapping with our communities, our critical infrastructure. So it's full suppression. But in as many places we can in the park, we want fire to play its natural role. So in the yellow zone, which is just a little bit further into the backcountry, where there are, some values at risk, maybe not all, not as many in the front country. We try to allow fires to play their natural role, but we still try to limit their spread, to make sure that the public is still safe and we're meeting our ecological objectives. And then further in the backcountry, as much as possible, we allow fire to play its natural role as a disturbance agent on the landscape to renew the ecosystem. And we do try to do prescribed fires in all zones. So this is just an example of managed fire and wildfire. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Verdant Creek wildfire in 2017. That was a lightning start fire. It experienced full suppression. It escaped initial attack and it burned throughout the season. And then on the right-hand side, this is actually from 2 days ago. We were conducting some prescribed fire in the backcountry, and you can see they do look fairly similar. Wildfires can occur in all seasons. They generally, though, in this area and many places in Western Canada, they are of high severity, high intensity. They're long in duration. They have many smoke impacts that can affect public health. And they're fairly difficult to mitigate because they often start during drought conditions. As opposed to prescribed fires, we can write prescriptions. They can occur in all seasons. And generally, they're of mixed intensity and severity. We're usually aiming for specific ecological impacts. We can shorten their duration by looking at weather patterns and trying to ensure that we have precipitation coming in the forecast. And so the smoke impacts can be lessened. They're variable in size because we can either create containment lines or use natural features for there to be barriers. And we can target atmospheric conditions that promote venting of smoke away from communities. So if you lengthen the time frame of that original graph, you can see here, I'll just take my up there. You can see here all the way up to this year. You can see where Parks Canada started our first prescribed fire, which is in the 1980s, 1983, and that how much fire we've restored to the landscape. And we have a target in the mountain national parks of 50% of the historic fire cycle. And what this does is promote landscape resilience. There's more heterogeneity. That big blanket of coniferous forests is broken up on the landscape. And so we can ensure that future wildfires kind of are broken up into smaller pieces. But it takes a lot of planning. And so this map here of all the red and green, the red shows fires, shows all of the old forests, the old coniferous forests in the park. You can see there are no shortage. And the green is actually all of our planned prescribed fires in the next 10 years. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to burn all of that area. It just, given that we have to wait for the right weather conditions and that sort of thing, we have to do lots of planning in order to get even aim for 50% of the historic fire cycle. So we actually have over 66,000 hectares of prescribed fire planned for the next 10 years, even though we're only targeting 14,000 hectares. And so a lot of work goes into these prescribed fires at the landscape level. This map is busy, but that's on purpose. So it shows all of the complete prescribed fires in the kind of darker shades of black, the proposed prescribed fires in orange, completed fuel management. So in the areas where we can't conduct fire, we do mechanical logging within the park. And that's so that we can facilitate these landscape level prescribed fires and also to protect the communities that are embedded within our parks. The yellow are proposed management, fuel management areas. And so hopefully by doing this, we can make places like the town of Banff that are surrounded by a fire-prone environment more resilient to climate change and fires in the future. This photo here is a 300 hectare mechanical fire guard that's just on the outside of just on the edge of the park to the east. The town of Canmore would be just out of the picture to the bottom. And then you can actually see the red tinge just beyond the logged block is actually a prescribed fire that was conducted in 2003. And this other picture that popped up is the West Sulphur Fire Guard, and that was just logged 2 years ago, and with another 147 hectares planned for this fall. And that will protect the town of Banff from any fires approaching from the west, which is our predominant wind direction. So that's at the landscape level scale. So it's at the big landscape level scale, it's at the meso level scale adjacent to town. And then there's a role for the public and homeowners to play with programs such as Fire Smart Canada, where homeowners and landowners can treat the fuels and look at what their building materials of their homes are. We also work within on the outskirts of town with our crews in the wintertime to fire smart any facilities on the boundary between the town and the park. And so all these things combined can kind of make our communities and the landscape a more resilient place. But the one thing we do need to keep in mind is obvious that public support and understanding of how fire works in the ecosystem and support for a prescribed fire program is paramount. If we don't have public support or the public doesn't understand what we're trying to do, it's very difficult for us to do this type of high risk kind of land management strategy. And so we do a lot of public outreach. We do a lot of emergency response training with the town of Banff. We communicate a lot with the public so they understand what we're doing and how it'll help in the future. So I just want to leave my talk with just a message of how, landscape heterogeneity and mitigating risk at multiple scales can result in more resilient forests and communities. And to understand that when it's too complex for fire, there needs to be other tools that we use to modify the fuel to facilitate landscape fire management. We can use other bits of science like fire behavior modeling to prioritize our implementation of these tools. And we need to work collaboratively with our partners, municipal governments, academia to achieve these objectives. And we really need to spend a lot of time with careful planning, and strong public support and engagement is paramount to the whole program. So that's all I've got for today, and I'll pass it on to Ed or Stephanie.
Hi again, everyone. So I'm Stephanie. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. So I'm joining you from Edmonton, which is the traditional Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of Métis and First Nations people. And I'm very humble and fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with many Indigenous communities in the province. How I came to study wildfires is as a health services and policy researcher. So unlike Ed, I haven't spent my career studying wildfires, but I am particularly interested in how traumatic, stressful events like natural disasters and public health crises impact the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, including Indigenous peoples and communities. So in response to the Fort McMurray wildfire, otherwise known as the Horse River wildfire in 2016, my research team and I created a research program called Indigenous Health and Resilience Through Disaster. So our logo here represents the fireweed. So for the wildfire scientists on joining us today, you'll know that the fireweed is a plant that springs up upon burned land. So that's really what the logo that we chose to symbolize, and it's a symbol of resilience. So the plants grow steadily, never in silos, and it's a symbol of regrowth. So there are multiple objectives to our research program. So we wanted to understand the factors that helped Indigenous elders, adults, and youth cope during and after the wildfire. Our team also examined how Indigenous residents and communities were affected by the evacuation and recovery process. And lastly, we wanted to identify the health and mental health impacts that the wildfire had for Indigenous peoples living both on reserve and settlements and in urban Fort McMurray. So the Horse River wildfire, it resulted in a mandatory evacuation of 88,000 residents and the loss of close to 2,400 homes and commercial buildings. It had an estimated cost of $8.9 billion. And it really resulted in extreme devastation, destruction, and displacement among residents in the area, which included loss of homes, jobs for many people, finances, lives, injuries, and impacts on mental health and separation from loved ones. So what about Indigenous peoples residing in the region of Wood Buffalo? So there's an estimated 80% of residents that were living in the 3 communities that were hardest hit by the 2016 wildfire in Fort McMurray. So those communities included Waterways, Beacon Hill, and Abasand. Métis people in the region, in the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, are represented by 6 Métis locals, and there are 5 First Nation communities in the region as well, including Fort McMurray 468, Fort McKay First Nation, Chippewa Prairie Dene First Nation, and Mikisew Cree First Nation. So what was particularly I was particularly interested in was understanding how our provincial health system responded to the health and mental health impacts following the disaster. So we know that the impacts from wildfires, and many researchers have studied the impacts of wildfires and other natural disasters on Indigenous peoples, and we found similar results that resulted from the evacuation experience itself. So what did the evacuation experience look like? How messaging around the evacuation was communicated, and the setup of hotels, so how residents, families, and communities were evacuated. Recent studies have examined the effects of disasters on health and well-being of Indigenous communities. So there's been a lot of research that's looked particularly at mental health and stress following natural disasters. And we also know that Indigenous communities tend to live in disaster-prone areas, which makes them particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. The other important thing to keep in mind here is that there are jurisdictional and intergovernmental relations that do affect disaster and emergency response in Indigenous communities. So in Canada, the provinces and territories are responsible for managing emergencies within their own respective jurisdictions. So Section 91 of the Constitution Act of 1867 prescribes the legislative authority of the Government of Canada to First Nations to manage and set up their own management plans, including conducting assessments of hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities facing natural disasters. However, we know that this doesn't always happen in the best possible way after disasters. And so sometimes there are inequities with respects to resources and how resources and funding are allocated to communities to help them in their response following a disaster. So one of the things that we know about disasters, the Fort McMurray disaster in particular, was that coming out of Alberta Health data, which is our provincial health authority, is that the wildfire in Wood Buffalo there was an average number, the average number of emergency department visits had gone up following the disaster in Fort McMurray. And so it increased from an average of 5.9 visits per day compared to 1.7 visits per day for the same time period 1 year prior to the wildfire in 2015. So we know that healthcare utilization rates tend to be lower among Indigenous residents compared to non-Indigenous populations. So things like racism, discrimination, and lack of culturally appropriate healthcare have been demonstrated to be barriers to healthcare among Indigenous peoples. And our finding also showed from the fire that that healthcare utilization for Indigenous residents following the fire in Fort McMurray remained low because of distrust of the health system, but also because a number of services had shut down. So part of that distrust was not being able to access health services when they needed, and also during the evacuation, when they evacuated to their host communities or cities, they experienced a number of challenges and barriers to accessing needed healthcare services during that time. So one of the things that we were interested in is Indigenous experiences or Indigenous ways of coping. So contemporary definitions of coping in the research literature generally include personal, family, and community characteristics that contribute to individuals' abilities to heal in the face of adversity or stress. However, these definitions are derived largely from research involving non-Indigenous populations and may fail to incorporate unique characteristics from Indigenous perspectives. So recognizing that all Indigenous peoples are unique and in terms of their unique histories, cultures, and languages, Indigenous perspectives of coping are often grounded at a cultural level and are focused on community relationships, identity, connection to the land, and culture across generations. So one of the things that we heard from Indigenous residents and communities was that the wildfire heightened their stress and mental health experiences as resulting from the fires. So they talked about things like displacement, destruction of the land, and disruption of traditional land-based activities that resulted from the fire. The quote here that I've included from one elder involved in our research really expresses this notion of how that disconnect and displacement from the land had affected his ability to carry out traditional practices like hunting. So the elder states, quoted here, "Nature is all gone now. I used to see deer and rabbits on the road, but now after that fire, there is hardly any traps for hunting. You travel towards Saskatchewan and there are no traps. There's hardly anything, no wildlife." Structural inequities is also something that came up in our research findings, which demonstrated the ways in which Indigenous peoples were able to cope following the 2016 wildfire. So some of the things that participants in our research had highlighted were things like disorganization with the evacuation and recovery response. And that particularly included how the evacuation plan was communicated to residents. So not just Indigenous residents, but all evacuees. And they noted that there were inequities in resources. So while the wildfire happened in Fort McMurray, so in the urban center, neighboring rural and remote communities outside of Fort McMurray were also devastatingly affected. So many of those communities outside of Fort McMurray were host communities for residents who had fled Fort McMurray and had evacuated to those communities initially before those rural and remote communities outside of the city who then decided to evacuate themselves. But when they had sought resources and support for their evacuation process, they felt that the number of resources that were allocated to urban Fort McMurray in comparison to some of the rural and remote communities outside of the city varied. And so it's important that we think about what those inequities are in terms of the number of communities that are devastated by natural disaster. Now, while disasters can change community relations and community cohesion, which result from the separation of families and loved ones, the fire also brought everyone together. So there was emphasis in our research from participants who noted that they appreciated the opportunity to connect with others in their community, that they were able to rely on their community members who offered support. Many families welcomed others into their home during that time. And one of the things that we had facilitated a year after the fire happened were sharing circles that brought together elders, adults, and youth to talk about their wildfire experience and the ways in which they were able to cope during the evacuation and following the disaster. So throughout their recovery. And many of those participants in the sharing circles noted that it was really that was the first opportunity for them to talk about their experience, and they appreciated the opportunity to connect with others who had gone through similar shared experiences, shared traumatic experiences following the fire. So how can we promote Indigenous health and well-being following a disaster? So one of the things that my team and I worked towards was creating a framework for promoting Indigenous health and well-being. This is a framework that can be applied in future disasters or other public health crises. And it really speaks to highlighting aspects of an Indigenous model of health and wellness. So it includes things like a holistic framework for understanding health and well-being. So under a holistic framework, Indigenous peoples do not separate physical, mental, and spiritual health, nor do they separate human health from that of the rest of the earth. One of the recommendations for incorporating a holistic framework in a disaster and emergency response is around cultural competence. So really enhancing and strengthening cultural competency among health service providers or health professionals, as well as emergency responders. And that would ensure cultural competency ensures the respect of Indigenous views of the world, ways of knowing, and values. It's important that we emphasize community-led emergency plans, and that includes the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous capacity, as well as community ownership and control in setting, in identifying and implementing emergency and disaster response plans within the community, and ensuring strong community engagement that's involved in the development of those plans. Another aspect of an Indigenous-led disaster response plan is that First Nations or all Indigenous peoples, aside, including non-Indigenous residents, should expect to see the same rapid response and return to pre-emergency standards following a disaster. So one of the gaps in the research is that there aren't any indicators of successful emergency management. So it's difficult for us to know where some of those inequities are, including resource inequities, in how we respond or how decision makers respond to a disaster, and that affects both Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. So one of the recommendations that would fall from that is to ensure that federal and provincial jurisdictional issues need to be clarified in the best interest in the spirit of reconciliation. Another key component of the framework is who we employ or who is engaged to respond on the ground. So contractors and others are often selected by outside governments or organizations. And so one of the things for us to think about as a recommendation is building that capacity within the communities as well, and encouraging communities to be closely involved in community assessments or hazard assessments. Strong communication. This is something that comes out in almost any research or study of a natural disaster, is how strong the communication system was in communicating the risks of the disaster. So in this context of wildfire, so how those risks are communicated to Indigenous communities, how those risks are framed, how Indigenous communities are also engaged in the framing of the impacts that resulted from the wildfire. So these are all important considerations in in a disaster and emergency response plan. And lastly, emergency and disaster plans need to be written with respect to Indigenous worldviews, ways of knowing, and values. So moving forward, following our research on the health and mental health impacts for the Fort McMurray wildfire among Indigenous residents and communities, is we're working towards creating an Indigenous mental health strategy for the region of Wood Buffalo. And this is following the Fort McMurray wildfire. So one of the things that we did was we ensured widespread consultation engagement among mental health professionals, including elders, youth, and those across the sectors, so education, justice, and health, to generate and prioritize key directions for an Indigenous-focused mental health response in the region. And this is really coming out of some of the significant mental health impacts that have resulted from the wildfire. And for those following the news, you would have heard that Fort McMurray has recently experienced a flood in May of this year. So as one elder would say, it's one traumatic event after another, so trauma on top of trauma. And so it's important for us to think to the future. And this is an example of how we're learning about what those mental health impacts particularly were following the 2016 wildfire. And how can we change this in terms of better responding to ensuring that Indigenous residents and communities have access to needed mental health services and supports in the event or in the context of future disasters. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that we led following the 2016 Horse River wildfire in Wood Buffalo. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or follow me on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everybody. That was just wonderful. What I really liked about it was that it wasn't fatalistic. I think everybody pointed to a path moving forward in some way, which was wonderful. And I think it speaks to the need for a national wildfire strategy where we involved Indigenous communities, the business communities, the provinces, the national parks. Jane, you're working with the province because the province borders the national parks. There has to be some kind of coordination. And one thing I really liked about what Sophie talked about was this the super moss that may solve a lot of our problems. Tell us a little bit more about sphagnum and why is it so super?
Well, yeah, especially when we're talking about peatland wildfires. Sphagnum is actually a genus of moss, so there's lots of different species of this sphagnum moss. But what it has in common is that it's very, very good at holding on to moisture. It can actually hold 400 times its own weight in water. And so in a fire-prone landscape, a moss such as that can have really, impactful ways to change wildfire behavior. So it's the structure of the moss, and when we sort of can promote the conditions that it grow on the ground surface, it protects whatever's underneath it from fire. And so that's one reason why it's so super. It also stores a lot of carbon. I think it's the genus of plant that stores the most carbon of any in the world. So it's really important that we figure out how to best promote it and maintain it on the landscape.
One more question: can we grow it?
Yeah, there are ways. People are working on trying to grow it in sort of laboratories and greenhouses, but it's so slow growing, which is one of its sort of key benefits, really, that it is so slow growing and so slow to decay also. But what we are doing in some of the peatlands, if they've become non-sphagnum dominated, there's things you can do to try and shift them back into a sphagnum dominated state. So removing some of the trees, opening up that canopy to let the light in is actually really good for sphagnum moss. As well as if peatlands are disturbed, you can re-wet them, so block any ditches or create pools in them to create wetter surface conditions, which of course the mosses really like.
Stephanie, one thing that I thought maybe you could comment on is we know that there's incredible psychological challenges associated, especially with First Nations community, which represent, I think, only 4% of the population, but 50% of the evacuations. But can you talk a little bit more about the toxicity of smoke from fire?
Sure, Ed. Well, so that wasn't something that our research team had looked at, but we do. It did come up a lot in our qualitative research with Indigenous residents and communities, where they spoke about their concern around the lingering smoke in the air. And so that was something that really was of grave concern to a number of Indigenous communities and residents. And so they spoke about how that they felt that their health had changed following the wildfire, that their and access to healthcare services at that time proved to be a challenge or barrier, just because of the discontinuation of services during the immediate evacuation. So they were concerned about respiratory health problems during that time, and that concern also resulted like among parents as well, who were concerned for their elderly parents and children and youth who are most vulnerable.
Now, can we make these communities more resilient? Having community centers with filters where people can go to at times where there's an awful lot of smoke. Are there immediate things that we can do?
Those are certainly some examples from what we know about in many of the Indigenous communities is having the resources to set something like that up. So that's something that I think a lot of communities are trying to find innovative ways of addressing some of the longer term impacts, such as that result from fires like smoke, that impact their physical health. But we have to keep in mind that many of the communities that are located there, they are located in more vulnerable, disaster-prone areas where they experience a number of inequities in terms of resources that sometimes prevent some of implementing some of those more resilient or adaptive technologies or equipment.
Speaking of stress, Jane, you must have one of the most stressful jobs in Parks Canada. You've got two things. One is that you've got the possibility of prescribed burn getting out of control, which has happened in Jasper National Park with the Syncline fire many, many years ago. Thankfully, that was contained. But then you have also the prospect of hundreds of thousands of people in the park faced with the potential wildfire that gets out of control. How do you cope with it?
Well, I guess like coping with the stress is like anybody trying to be mindful. But I guess in the scope of my job, I think it's all about the preparedness and all the planning that goes into all the things that I talked about. So, when we're doing prescribed fires, definitely, there's a level of risk there that because we rely on the weather so much that we can't completely take the risk out. But with, the years of planning that goes into each prescribed fire and the careful monitoring of the weather conditions under which we light them and all the training we give to our staff in order to contain them where we want them, that can kind of like make it as least stressful as possible. And we are ready for any contingencies. With the community here, we do have a really great working relationship with the town of Banff Fire Department. We do lots of emergency preparedness training. We do talk to the public a lot about, what our emergency response plans are and how the community can help if those types of natural disasters occur. And we do a lot of training scenarios where we kind of simulate wildfires and figure out how we're going to organize ourselves, what we're going to do. And so it's all about preparedness. So you take as much of the uncertainty out as you can so that you kind of reserve a stress for that piece that you can't get rid of.
So you've learned by example as well, is that the Kenow fire in Waterton was, I think, will go down in history as a textbook response to a impending wildfire. I know it didn't happen in Banff, but I'm sure you know very much about it. Maybe the public would be interested in this fire because it was really significant and it turned out to be successful in almost every order of response. Can you tell us a little bit about that fire?
Mm-hmm. So again, it wasn't in Banff, but it was in Waterton Lakes National Park. I did go down as one of the Unified Incident Commanders of that fire shortly after the main event, which was a very large wind-driven fire that moved through Waterton Lakes National Park, a substantial proportion of the park. It was significant in size in that it covered the majority of the area that is protected by Waterton Lakes National Park, but also that there is a community within that park as well. And the incident management team evacuated that community well in advance. They held public meetings to inform homeowners of activities they could do ahead of time. The former fire management officer had spent a decade or more conducting fire smart and fuel management treatments around the community, much like we do around Banff. And all of those things combined allowed for incident management team that was there on the evening that the big fire rolled through to ensure that both the responders and the public were safe, that the public was already evacuated by the time the fire came through, and that the firefighters that were there had the best chance of suppressing the fire and limiting loss in that community.
I think a testament to that is I was in there shortly after, and all of the people living in the town sites had signs up in front of their house and on the streets thanking Parks Canada for doing such a great job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that that came out of that, and I'll ask all of you perhaps to answer, was that a year or so after the Keynote fire, we saw how fire can affect not just air quality, but water quality. And Cameron Falls, if anybody's been to Waterton, it's just in the town site, and it's a beautiful waterfall that flows crystal clear year round. But after a thunderstorm, it just turned absolutely black. And I think this is one of the more frightening things that we see as a possibility, is that fire may affect our drinking water quality, or our drinking water. Sophie or Stephanie, do you want to weigh in on that? I know peat is such a great purifier, and without peat, there's really nothing to absorb that carbon.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Ed. So after fire, when a lot of the peat or soil, sort of the organic matter in the soils, has been combusted, and all of that above ground vegetation and their roots as well that really act to anchor the soil in place. Once they've been burned, you usually get like a big spike in erosion and a lot of sediment transport, which can move down into waterways. And especially with respect to peat, sometimes what happens in particularly more severe fires is that the surface of the peat becomes hydrophobic. So instead of your precipitation infiltrating down into the soil and taking a nice slow path and getting purified, as you say, filtered on the way, it doesn't happen like that. It runs right off the surface and picks up whatever it can in its path. And we did see after the Fort McMurray fire, for example, a big spike in the treatment cost of water, because you had so much sediment and dissolved organic carbon entering the waterways that would normally be locked up in those ecosystems.
Jane, I think you wanted to weigh in, but following that, we also have a question from a viewer. So you want to talk a little bit about watershed protection?
Yeah, so one of the ways that prescribed fire can help in terms of the water quality kind of challenge is that because we can plan prescribed fires for a specific type or ecological objective or a lower to moderate severity fire, we can use that to protect watersheds. So if you imagine wildfires occurring during drought conditions, there is the possibility that an entire watershed could be taken out by a large wildfire. If we do strategically placed prescribed fires to break up some of that, the forest in those watersheds, we can maybe limit the extent and impact of future wildfires by breaking up that landscape.
And we've seen examples of it. At Sydney, the Canberra fires had built a new water treatment plant. Fort Collins was nearly knocked out. I think Fort McMurray now is spending 2 or 3 times the amount they need to on treating water quality because of all the carbon that's coming down the Athabasca River. But we have one question from a viewer for you, Jane, and that is, are planned burns limited to 50% of historical norms due to politics, resource availability, or for social reasons?
All of the above plus more. So we aim for 50% because of, it does take a lot of planning. Also, we do allow for those managed wildfires to play their natural role. So the expectation is that between wildfires that we can carefully manage for public safety and prescribed fire, that we might achieve or start to achieve close to the historic 50 or fire cycle. That being said, it is quite difficult to plan and pull these off. I'm currently monitoring what's going on with that prescribed fire I had in my presentation. We lit it on Friday, and so we just have to seize those opportunities. But in a year like this where it was quite rainy in Canada, we weren't sure that we would get an opportunity to conduct the prescribed fires. And so we kind of just have to be ready when the landscape is, and that doesn't always happen. So 50% is a reasonable goal given, the complications of safety, political support, the public support, and weather.
Here's a question from another viewer that I get asked all the time, and I can weigh in on this one as well, but I'll let you three take the first stab at it. What actions can everyday people take to help minimize the unprecedented dangers of wildfire? It could be related to prevention or the aftermath in the long term or the short term. Well, how about me then? I think there's so many things you can do if you're living. You're living in some place like Kelowna in a forested community. You can make your own place fire smart. I'm looking out my window right now, and I live overlooking the Saskatchewan River in Edmonton, and I've got 4 giant spruce trees in front of my house, 2 beautiful ornamental junipers, and the house is wood, the fence is wood. If there's a fire that goes into the river valley, I'm probably hooped, and so is my neighbor because he's got cedar shake shingles. So I think, we can all look at ourselves and say, how resilient are we when it comes to fire? That's certainly one thing you can do, is just have a look at your surroundings. And if you really feel uncomfortable, there are fire smart programs that you can look at online that will help you go through the different steps that you can take. Some of them, will cost you. Some are fairly simple. But I think that the other thing that I would say, that I've said many times in the past, I think that with the National Wildfire Strategy, we've got to have incentives put in place so that people can make themselves more resilient to fire. Banff is lucky because they've got talented people like Jane. They've got a really good fire department. But if you go to a place like Salt Spring Island, which is entirely forested, exactly the same size as Waterton National Park, and it's heavily forested, and the only way off the island is by ferry. What do you do there if a fire roars through? They don't have the tax base, basically, to be able to make themselves more resilient. So I think that we've got to start shifting some of the subsidies that we offer to, say, resource companies, and transfer them over to First Nations communities, for example, and small forested communities in Canada, to make them more resilient to fire. Stephanie, I see you nodding, so please jump in.
Mm-hmm. No, I was going to add something on the opposite spectrum relating to psychological health. And so one of the things that we learned, which wasn't so unique to the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, is a response to addressing health or mental health impacts. We know from the response and recovery phases after a disaster, and the immediacy of a disaster, it's about managing the spread of the wildfire, ensuring that everyone's safely evacuated and safely returning back home. And one of the things that we learned from the Fort McMurray wildfire is that our provincial and municipal health system or the municipality and provincial health system didn't respond to those mental health impacts until year 3 following the wildfire. So here you have residents 3 years post disaster, where we're starting to see an increase in mental health services and supports that are becoming available. Not to say that there weren't services available at the time, but there was funding that was allocated to ensuring that there were necessary mental health services and supports. So funding, let's say, to hire a mental health therapist who would go out into the communities 2 to 3 days a week. And again, we didn't see funding flow into allocate into those services to address mental health until 3 years after the fire. But really, those services and funding to address psychological stress need to be there from the beginning, from day one. And so I think that's something that we need to think about when we're looking at how to address the unprecedented impacts of a disaster, is ensuring that we're not just trying to deal with the response, the recovery, and trying to, mitigate the spread, but we also need to pay attention to health and mental well-being as well, and ensuring that those residents are protected.
Another question from a viewer: this year's fire season is not too bad in Canada, and that's quite true. And it's a question that all three, maybe Jane, this is best for you, because I know that you rely on some of these indicators, but are there early indicators that can help predict the severity of fire seasons?
Yes and no. I always tell people when they ask me at the beginning of the fire season if I can predict what's going to happen, I ask how reliably people look at the weather and how far out they can see. But definitely there are, large scale climate patterns, El Niños and large scale kind of global climate patterns that can help to sort of predict things. This year it was fairly wet here. We had a lot of kind of Arctic lows and things that brought a whole bunch of precipitation. But what that does is make the vegetation grow quickly and with more biomass, which then cures as we go into the fall, which can result in a higher fuel load and a potentially higher potential for wildfires in the fall. So we do look at kind of at the 10,000 foot level, those types of climate patterns. And then we start to look, more at the short and midterm atmospheric pressure gradients and things like that to try to figure out what's coming our way. And most fire managers and agencies are monitoring the weather pretty much on a daily basis. And for us, when we're going into prescribed fire, we're looking at it almost on an hourly basis. So we're kind of looking at it again at multiple scales to help us out.
Sophie, do you want to weigh in, or there's another question as well?
I'll speak quickly to the susceptibility of peatlands and predicting their vulnerability to wildfire in a given season. We normally work on an annual to multi-annual sort of scale when we're thinking about the peatland fires for the season. There's some regions, such as the Boreal Plains, that can undergo multi-annual year droughts, and so that if you're in a water deficit period, your peatlands might not have filled back up to their healthiest, wettest levels, and so especially if you get a small snowpack year, you're starting on a bit of a back foot with regard to peatlands, because they'll be drier than expected, and that can lead to more severe fires in the spring, especially in Alberta and Western Canada.
And the next question is probably applied to you as well, is that a viewer asks, a lot of Northern Ontario's boreal forests with so much carbon holding peat, other than seeding it with sphagnum moss and prescribed fires, clearing, what other techniques can or will be applied to protect these forests? And this viewer suggests something that I think has been done in the past with some interesting results, and building canals through it, possibly. I mean, is that an option? When we try to dig through a peatland?
Well, I would say maybe the most important first step would be to halt any disturbance of peatlands, because they're so good at keeping themselves wet when they're in a pristine state, that if you can protect them in their natural state, then you wouldn't need the additional measures. But as the viewer says, the seeding with sphagnum and the prescribed fires in the low severity season or conditions are really the best to maintain those forests and protect them and protect that carbon especially. But I do think moving forward, bigger, sort of maybe more mechanistic restoration techniques might be able to be brought in or be brought in. But for now, definitely sort of ditch blocking and restoring disturbed peatlands is highest up there on the list, along with conserving peatlands in their healthy states.
I could add in maybe one thing that's interesting is California is now looking at reintroducing beavers into the Sierra Nevadas and places like that so that they can hold water back and recreate wetlands that have been drained. And I think this is one of the big challenges that we face right across the boreal forest, is that with a lot of resource development, a lot of residential building as well, is that we're draining peatlands, wetlands at an astonishing rate. And in doing so, we're making those areas more vulnerable to fire. Because usually in the past, and I think Stephanie and Jane, I'm sure you'll agree, is that a wetland is the best thing to stop a fire, certainly better than a water bomber. Jane, that's a good question. How much does it cost to bring in a water bomber?
It depends on how much you use them, but regularly, millions of dollars goes into fire suppression. Often, when you compare the costs of fire suppression to prescribed fire in terms of cost per hectare, it's orders of magnitude, hundreds of dollars a hectare for prescribed fire to tens of thousands of dollars a hectare for wildfire. And so typically, across most suppression agencies in North America, the wildfire suppression costs far outweigh the cost of prescribed fire, but the mitigative kind of benefits of prescribed fire kind of are the opposite to the impacts of wildfire. So it's definitely a balance there.
I'm sure you get this a lot, is that many people just assume that if you have enough water bombers and people on the ground, you can put out a fire without any problem. It's just not the case, is it?
No, because often the wildfires are happening during these drought periods, which are becoming more frequent and more severe. And so, the suppression efforts that we have, the primary thing for us is the protection of the public and our first responders. And so often what we're doing with our suppression efforts and aerial water techniques is to hold fires and give us the best chance to do some suppression before Mother Nature does it for us. Because often with these very large wildfires, no amount of human intervention will really put a stop to it. It's most often put out by a large precipitation event as opposed to human intervention.
I started off my talk with Indigenous burning and how the Europeans that arrived on the scene really tried to put a stop to it. Some people recognize its value, and now Parks Canada is certainly among the agencies in Canada that has recognized that light burning, controlled burning, whatever you want to call it, is really important. And I'll throw this one at you, Stephanie, is that one of the last things that I got to see was in Teslin in the Yukon, where the First Nations there were basically fire smarting their community and selling the merchantable timber at a profit, but also using all of the snags and the slash to power their boilers. So they've essentially converted a liability, what they would have ordinarily burned, and are now heating their community centers. And it strikes me is that, and I think you've alluded to it, but maybe you can expound on it more, is that we still have an awful lot to learn from them, don't we?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for that, Ed. One of the interesting things, when I first went into studying the impacts from the Fort McMurray wildfire, I was so focused on impacts and understanding how the Indigenous communities and residents were impacted following the fire. But it was interesting to hear from many Indigenous residents that they didn't see the wildfire as necessarily as a negative thing. I mean, they did speak a lot about and shared with my research team on what the impacts were to their livelihood, to their communities, their mental health, their well-being. But they also saw that the fire was an opportunity for regrowth, to slash what was there previously, and an opportunity to start back new again. So while it's important to keep in mind in terms of Indigenous communities and their intimate relationship to the land and what the natural environment or the earth means to them, their perspective and understanding of the fire and the impact of wildfires, it was really interesting to learn about. So they saw it as an opportunity for regrowth. They saw it as an opportunity for us to get rid of any of the existing toxins currently in the environment that were there. So there were some elements of opportunities that the wildfire can present in terms of going forward.
Another question from a viewer: just as one would not encourage settlement in flood-prone areas, are parts of North America at the point where governments are discouraging settlement in fire-prone areas, for example, the Pacific U.S. Northwest? Anybody want to take that one on?
I'm unaware of any settlement of that nature, but I do know in the States there are places that have legislated a level of prescribed fire required in certain areas to ensure that that wildfires are mitigated. But I'm not aware of anything like that.
I had a comment. I was invited to speak to the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers last summer, not this past summer, but this summer before. And at the time, there was a federal cabinet minister who was going around Saskatchewan and Manitoba handing out checks so that to get people out of the flood-prone regions. And I suggest to the ministers that, unless we start learning how to live with fire, we may have to do that sometime in the future. But I don't think that we do, because I think that we can make ourselves more resilient. It's just that we can't let it go so far as California has done now. And I see that there's a better, someone said, should governments be discouraging settlement in fire-prone areas? And I probably have answered that, but does anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll weigh in, Ed. So, and just to comment with respects to Indigenous communities or First Nation communities on reserve in particular, yes, governments have been actually discouraging or trying to encourage communities to relocate elsewhere. So we actually saw this following the Fort McMurray wildfire when it came to rebuilding homes that were lost. And this actually happened a few years back in 2013 in Alberta and with southern floods, where they were encouraged to rebuild the homes away from the floodplain. And communities were concerned by that. Firstly, they weren't actually consulted or engaged in that process in terms of what the plan involved in terms of rebuilding of homes and where. And with many of the families in the communities, they're not single family unit homes, right? They live with extended families, and they live in their own, again, close to many of their family members. So relocate. Complicated.
Well, thanks everybody. This was absolutely wonderful. I think there's a number of different take-home messages. Is that the fire problem, the challenge is not going to go away. And I think that anybody who doubts that just needs to look at California right now. Prior to 2003, California did not have a wildfire problem. 17, I think now it is 20 of the worst fires ever have occurred since 2003. And that problem is migrating into other parts of the world where like Portland, where you don't expect to see fires. So I think it's going to be something that we have to learn to live with in the future. And as we heard from our guests today, the three experts, is that there is a pathway forward. I think that this is something that we can get on top of it before it overwhelms us as it has in California. And I think that we also have a country which I think, if we look south to our neighbors, is that I think we're more receptive to taking on challenges, accepting the fact that climate change is a factor, that we are also part of the problem, that this is not going to go away, and that we have to look at fire as a meteorological event that can't be stopped like a hurricane. So we've got to learn to live with fire before it really enslaves us. I don't think we'll ever be masters of fire, but there is an in-between. So I want to thank everybody who tuned in. Great questions, great presentations, and remarkably minimal technical issues. I thought I'm always fearful of these things, but thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody.
Thanks.
Now, just to finish up, I want to thank our speakers. Thanks, Ed, Sophie, Jane, and Stephanie. That was a fascinating discussion. Strangely, I feel hopeful and better. I love that we are having evidence-based decision-making here about how we can do better in the future. So we hope you enjoyed today's discussion as much as we did. And please share your feedback with us. We'd love to know what you think and what you'd like to see from us in the future. If any members are watching, and if you're not, maybe you want to be a member. Next, we're hosting our annual general meeting, our AGM, online later this week. If you haven't, check your inbox for details, because we have asked all the members if they want to join. If you have any questions, you can email us. And on October 16th, very exciting, we're having the Great Pandemic Bake Off. I can hardly wait. When the Great Canadian Baking Show Season 2 runner-up, Satch and Seth, will walk us through the science of baking and is going to show us how to make gingerbread cake with whipped cream. Yes. And because 2020 isn't terrifying enough, we're going to be looking at the science of scary on October 25th, exploring why bats get a bad rep, whether you should fear the walking dead, and why there's nothing to fear but fear itself. You can find out about all of our upcoming events on our website, rciscience.ca/what's on. And thanks again to everybody for joining. Terrific questions from the audience. And again, thanks to our speakers. See you later. Stay safe.